All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, something weird is happening in the U.S. Senate. Chuck Schumer has been somewhat less lame than expected as he has taken control as Senate Majority Leader. First, he partnered with Elizabeth Warren to call for significant student debt cancellation by executive order. But more significantly, he seems pretty clear-eyed about GOP intransigence and the lessons of the Obama era. He recently said, "We cannot do the mistake of 2009 where they whittled down the program so that the amount of relief was so small that the recession lasted 4 or 5 years. And then on the ACA when they spent a year and a half negotiating and then didn't come to any agreement." Now, these comments should be obvious to anyone who was breathing and sentient back in 2009, but they mark a dramatic admission from one of the top leaders of the Democratic establishment. Up until this point, any slowness or failures in the recovery were all George W. Bush's fault, and the Affordable Care Act was not to be questioned whatsoever, and above all, our Lord and Savior Barack Obama was to be only praised and never ever critiqued. Implicit, of course, in Schumer's comments is an acknowledgement that Barack Obama did in fact screw up in his approach, allowing the Republican Party's outrageous and immoral tactics to hamstring his administration and, more importantly, to doom millions of Americans to a prolonged struggle. Now, if you really want to go crazy, you can actually tie a pretty clear line from Obama's meager response to the rise of Donald J. Trump. So what's going on here? Has Schumer suddenly shed his longtime establishment and Wall Street skin to become a Sanders leftist? Not likely. Instead, his evolution is tied directly to a need to protect his left flank in the state of New York. In particular, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has both been publicly critical of Schumer and failed to rule out a primary run against him. You don't think she's the one putting pressure on him? Well, when Rachel Maddow asked him his legislative priorities, the first word out of his mouth was climate. That is, of course, famously AOC's signature issue. Now, if she did jump in the race, it'd be an uphill battle, of course. But you'd be a fool to not consider her a real threat. In a state as blue as New York is, Schumer's much more vulnerable to a left-wing primary challenge than he is to a Republican general election challenge at this point. The bottom line is that Schumer's historical positioning is at odds with his constituents, and especially with the constituents that would vote in a Democratic primary. AOC is threatening to make him pay for that divergence, and in doing so is forcing him to respond in what is an ultimately cynical way by moving, or at least signaling a move, to the left. Do I care whether Schumer's shift is genuine or cynical? No, I do not. I only care that someone in a position of power is feeling heat from their left flank and appears to be responding accordingly. But it's not only blue state Democrats who find themselves at odds with their constituents or with primary voters. Case in point, right-wing Democrats Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. So a new effort is taking shape to exploit that divergence and apply pressure. Some of AOC's former top aides and Justice Dems founders have announced an effort to recruit primary challengers to run against Manchin in West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona as a direct response to their resistance to abolishing the filibuster. Now, there are a few things that are really interesting about this direction. First of all, they're going after incumbents in red states and rejecting this totally BS notion that people like Manchin are reflecting their constituents when they block populist economic policies. Former AOC aide Shoykat Chakrabarti told Politico, "We sort of have this theory that the voters in Arizona and the voters in West Virginia would care more about action. They care more about jobs in their community and money in their pockets than they do about an arcane Senate rule called the filibuster." Interesting take. The other thing that's interesting is that they aren't looking for candidates who are uniformly left-wing, but instead are focused on recruits who are populist and will vote to get rid of the filibuster in order to reduce Senate gridlock. There's some reason to believe that this group is going to find success, too. They already helped to pressure Manchin to move on direct stimulus checks after he had told the Washington Post absolutely not when asked if he supported the payments. The counterexample, of course, is Biden. He hasn't felt any political pressure in terms of a threat to his agenda or in terms of facing a primary challenge from the left himself, so he's felt free to play footsie with the right and ignore completely the demands of progressives. That's why he had a 2-hour meeting with Republicans at the White House over their laughable COVID plan and didn't even bother to respond to a letter from progressives pushing for $2,000 monthly checks. That's why he's already said he would negotiate with right-wingers like Manchin to further means test the direct payments, and has shown zero willingness to cancel student debt, as progressives, of course, have been asking. This is really not complicated whatsoever. Politicians are cynical actors. If you want them to move, you've got to have a credible threat. In fact, one of the most encouraging things about the current landscape is that Democrats are really starting to have to worry about their primary challengers in a way that Republicans did back in the Tea Party era. Waleed Shahid tweeted this graphic, and it's really quite fascinating. So in recent years, Republicans have far outpaced Democrats in ideological primary challenges to incumbent representatives. So those huge red spikes you see there, those were the Tea Party years when right-wingers high on Glenn Beck monologues started primarying establishment Republicans, and in quite a few cases, they actually started to win. That direction of the Republican Party has, of course, ultimately been deeply destructive. I could do a whole other monologue on the policy-free rage and conspiracy that spiked in the Tea Party years and continues to play itself out with the rise of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. We will leave that one for another day. But these days, more ideological primary energy is unfolding in primaries on the left, and it's actually creating some pressure for cynical operators to do a little bit better. We will see what the Biden era brings and whether that trend continues and if they are actually successful in pushing the Democratic Party left. But that is the place that you should be watching. The general election doesn't matter nearly as much these days as what happens in these primary battles. And Sagar, that graphic with the Tea Party is so fascinating because it has long been the case almost uniformly since the 70s that Republicans have been more willing to launch ideological primary battles than Democrats. And that has actually flipped around in recent years. That's an extraordinary shift that we are going to see play out in our politics.
No, exactly. And the rise of the ideological primary on the right is actually what changed the incentive structure. And if you want to know where the deficit hawkery comes from, it's because a lot of these people, what do the senators who are most like this have in common? They were there during that wave. They still think, because the Senate is an old institution, back in 2010 terms, they're like, oh man, if I vote for this, I'm going to get primary from the right. It's like, guys, you're not going to get primary from the right because of that. But you might, if you vote for impeachment or something like that. They just don't have the right ideological view of their own base. And it just goes to show that they're dramatically out of touch. But it can be weaponized. And look, the Tea Party obviously weaponized it for to achieve bad policy ends.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean the strategy was bad. The strategy is actually quite good. You can freeze everybody into place. They destroyed John Boehner, literally ran the man out of town. These are all very important things. This is why Chuck Schumer is doing a lot of the stuff that he's doing. I am absolutely certain that if it wasn't even for a credible threat, and look, I don't think she would win a primary. I mean, in terms of New York State politics, it's a weird place, but just the threat, having to spend millions of dollars defending it and the media spectacle, because it would be one of the most watched races of all time, that alone is worth being okay, let me try and buy off.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. This forced these people to do something. I like it.
Yeah, because that's the only real threat that he would have.
Exactly.
Right? He's not going to get beat by a Republican in New York these days. I mean, those days are over. So the only thing he has to actually worry about is a threat from his left, and AOC is a credible challenger. I agree with you. I think she'd have a tough time winning. It seems like upstate New York would go for Schumer.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to take that chance,
Yeah,
though.
why try?
You don't want to take that chance. So he's feeling pressured to actually be a little bit better. We see them starting the budget reconciliation process. You've heard him really from the beginning sounding the right notes about, hey, we got to do this, we got to do it fast, we got to do whatever we can to get these efforts through. So you actually have a real point of leverage with him. What's interesting with this new effort from some of AOC's former advisors, Justice Democrats founders, is that their model previously has been just to focus on blue districts, right? The fact that they're recruiting challengers to Manchin and Sinema in Arizona because they recognize that there is a big split between where Manchin and Sinema are on the minimum wage and where they are on COVID relief, and where not only their state is, they're out of step with where their state is, but they're wildly out of step with where the primary base is.
Yeah.
That creates a vulnerability. And people like Manchin and Sinema, they've never thought about having to respond to that, because the truth of the matter is they are out on a limb extremists in terms of their economic views. So applying pressure in that way is the only way. And then the other piece is, look, if you want Joe Biden to move, this is the only way you're ultimately going to get him to, is if he feels that same type of political pressure and threat.
I actually was just reading in Politico Playbook this morning that it's funny the language that they use. It's all just ideologically wrong. They're like, Biden is being pushed left by not caving on stimulus. And I'm like, is that a leftist position? I mean, I don't think that's right. But more what it was is they were like, Biden's natural inclination in order to compromise on 1.1 trillion, 1.2 trillion or whatever with the GOP senators and negotiate down is being told by a lot of people in the White House. We're like, listen, we can't do that. We'll get eaten alive by our own party. Yes. See? I mean, they're literally checking the president's bad instincts on this particular case. That's an example, again, of I don't even look at that as like a left-right thing just because we know that this is so broadly bipartisan. For the once, I agree with Ron Klain. He was like, yeah, he's like COVID relief at $1.9 trillion is a bipartisan bill because it's 83% support.
Yeah.
83.
Just because these idiots here
Just
don't
because these
support
idiots
it
don't support it doesn't mean
no
that the actual
Republicans
people do. I was like, yeah, I agree with him, man. And, that this is the thing that we need to update our language for and just look at what are the actual things you can check politicians on. And this is where Joe Manchin is dramatic. And I love all the Manchin stands like he's the only one that can win there. I'm like, really? There's not many socially conservative people who are economically liberal in West Virginia? I think so. And they all voted for Trump. So it's not that hard in order to go and find somebody to do it.
Yeah, indeed. Or at least make him feel like there's some possibility there. The Republican billionaire governor got to his left. Like, he can do a little bit better. All right, Sire, looking forward to your radar. That's next.